Extra, extra, read all about it. Podboy's hopping in a time machine and going back to piss on Hitler and his shoes. I'm the Nazi puncher man, Matisse Van Rossum.
I'm Mr. Helper, Cleveland Mosier.
You are Mr. Helper.
I am the cake boy, Ben Sheets.
And we are going back in time today, way far back, the farthest back we've ever been, to the year 1944, the height of the largest war, the biggest war, and some say the most stylish war. I'm talking, of course, about World War II, and we're talking about Fritz Lang's Ministry of Fear. Isn't that right, Cleveland?
It sure is. We are talking about that.
This was your pick.
It was.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So one of the key reasons I picked this film is, of course, my dad recommended it to me, being a, Fritz Lang film, 1940s.
It's a very your dad film.
It absolutely is. Well said. I caught it about 5 years ago, and I wanted to just kind of come back to it and see, if it held up to, what I'd originally thought, and, just kind of re-jog the memory a little bit on it, because there's a number of things I enjoyed about the movie that I wanted to see again. The premise is a gentleman is released from an asylum at origin unknown. We don't know why he's leaving this asylum and going back out into society, what he's, what initially got him committed, if he's a stable person, if he isn't. He travels to London during the height of the Blitz, and is inevitably wrapped up in a spy conspiracy that has all sorts of macabre twists and turns. Yeah, it's the essential plot, I believe.
Yeah, this was a first-time viewing for both Ben and I.
Yep.
I've seen several other Fritz Langs, but dude has a shitload of movies.
Is it over 100? I believe it's something.
I don't know if it's that high, but
it's high.
It's way up there.
Yeah. The thing is, dude started in the silent era, and during the silent era, he was churning out a couple a year.
Right.
The thing about silent movies too are, while he may have name credit for the silent films directed, some of those more minor ones, some of it is just name recognition. A lot of times in those studio systems, they would have ghost directors, uncredited directors, stuff like that.
Well, we talked about that a bit when we talked about The Thing from Another World, which is under the name of Howard Hawks, but may not have been directed by him, up for some debate.
Howard Hawks in quotation.
Right, exactly. But, I thought this was a pretty fun film. I think that it's somewhat familiar territory for Fritz Lang with stuff like this. I was reminded a lot of M. Which is a film of his that I really like a lot. Yeah,
I love M. The thing about M, though, and the weird thing for me is I feel like, and this may have been just limitations of the Hays Code at the time in the 40s, but I feel like M was a bit edgier, more hard-hitting of a movie.
Yeah, well, it was about child murder.
Yeah,
so.
Well, I mean, it's inevitable for that. I don't know. I saw the similarities, and I kept comparing it in my head, and I was like, man, even emotionally, I don't think this movie hits quite as hard as that. And I mean, loaded subject matter, but I thought this movie was very Hitchcockian in a lot of ways.
Yes,
It
definitely.
reminded me of the classic Hitchcock thrillers in the way it's set up.
Like the 39 Steps.
Yeah, you have that.
And The Man Who Knew Too Much.
You have that
like
classic MacGuffin setup with the cake. It's just an object to drive the narrative forward. Sometimes MacGuffins serve a purpose, sometimes they don't. In this movie, it did, but it definitely was the main thing that drove the story forward.
Well, I mean, it wraps up the film, but we lose the cake, fairly early on into the film.
Yeah, but the idea that the cake has something to do with what
significance. The cake's significance. Yeah, it's at the heart of.
It's a MacGuffin.
It's a classic.
Of course, it's a classic MacGuffin. A MacGuffin is not a negative thing to have. I think.
No.
It definitely serves its purpose. But yeah, it is revealed what it is at the end, which is kind of atypical for a MacGuffin. But I think the what is much less important in the film than the why.
Yes.
And the who.
Yeah.
Definitely wanted to key in on the opening sequence of the film with the ticking clock.
Loved that. Thought that was great.
Yeah, like with the opening credits just holding on like the moving pendulum, and once the credits end, the camera pulls back across the room, and you see like our main character sitting in the asylum, like in his little room, like just staring at the clock,
counting down the seconds until when he's released.
Yeah, and on the nose of it's like 6 or whenever, like on the nose, like the doctor or whatever comes in and says, "Oh, you're ready to go. Time to leave." And he asks him where he wants to travel to. He says London, and he walks out. And that's when it's revealed with a nice good old camera pan and then pull in. You know, you see that he's leaving an asylum.
Right.
And that probably one of my kind of favorite aspects of the film is that we see our protagonist like leaving an asylum. Like I think that's a very intriguing premise for a main character to be like, well, is he our hero? Is he not? Like he must be reformed, but what is he reformed of?
Yeah.
And you know, like what kind of dark past does he have? And it's I think it's a little bit more interesting than like your standard like noir detective or expat character. Like there's a degree of risk, you know, behind his character and tension
into that film noirish aspect of having a lead character with a dark past that, you know, may have a shady background.
Oh, most definitely.
You know, it works well in that.
But what I like about it is that we know he's leaving in an asylum, but for the most part, he's shown to be like a completely normal, like polite, generally kind man. So it's like that adds a different layer of like what the fuck is going on here, because like he seems like a totally average dude.
Yeah, like well-tempered.
Well-tempered, like not angry, not seemingly nervous or anxious, just like totally even, like kind to people, stuff like that. It's like, well, he was fucking leaving the asylum. Like, what was he doing at the goddamn asylum?
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, you know, it throws his credibility into question throughout the movie in a really cool way, because he is convinced about this cake thing. No one's going to believe him because he got out of a fucking asylum.
Yeah, he's going around telling people that he's caught up in, like, a Nazi spy ring conspiracy, and that, like, secret Nazis in England are like trying to hunt him down, and people are just like, you just got out of an asylum, like,
right? You're
fucking crazy.
I love that too. Like it kind of shows like the societal reflection of how even at the height of conspiracy, like people were kind of had a disregard for conspiracy.
Well, yeah, I mean, considering your source too, like,
yes,
despite the fact that he's seemingly completely even-tempered, like it adds a question of credibility. Like, is he reliable? And considering the fact that he is our protagonist, he's got that quality of, like, the unreliable narrator, because you don't really know if, even though we're seeing it, since we're seeing it from his perspective, is it really happening that way? But there are a few times that indicate otherwise that I do think work, because it does make him more sympathetic. It's not like, oh, well, dude's just crazy. Like when he gets on the train with the cake and the old blind guy comes in, and we get those shots of like while our guy is looking out the window that the blind guy is not actually blind and he's like looking at him. I thought that sequence.
Yeah, I did want to get to that. So yeah, when he gets to backtrack a little bit, he leaves the asylum. He gets to London, and he stumbles upon a carnival. And
no, that's outside the asylum. It's when he's at the train station waiting for the train that's going to take him to London.
That's right.
He's killing time going to the fair because he's been in the asylum for 2 years, isolated. So he wants to surround himself with people.
Right, and that's why he's at the station. Yeah, so he goes in, and it's your standard fair carnival, and they have a cake weighing contest. He guesses a number. He goes in to see a fortune teller. The fortune teller kind of shrugs him off a little bit, this older lady, and she says, and then she stops him and says, like, go guess this number instead. And so he does, and he gets the cake.
More specifically, she tells him at the beginning that she's not allowed to tell him the future, only about the present and the past. And he gets fed up with that, and he's like, no, I just want to know about my future.
Because he clearly has hang-ups about his past.
And it's when he asks about his future that she then says, you want the cake, go tell them this amount.
Exactly. Even though the number seems preposterous, he wins the cake and leaves. During his leaving, there's a bit of confusion between the some of the other people at the carnival, but he leaves with his cake regardless. And then boards the train, and at this point, we get to what you were bringing up, where he's on his train, and before the train leaves the station, an old blind man joins him in his cab, and I love that character. Like he's like this is kind of old wizened farmer who is blind and starts just talking, just making up small talk and conversation, and they share the cake. But did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, no, I mean, I pretty much said what I wanted to already. I just thought that was such a great touch that when, like, they hear the air raid sirens and, like, the protagonist is looking out the curtain, then we cut to the blind guy who's sort of just, like, looking up vacantly, and then, like, his eyes sharpen, and he, like, looks over, and he looks down at the cake, and it's just, like, such a great moment where, like, oh, shit, this dude's not actually blind.
Yeah.
And then we get the...
great irony,
and we get the great part where he picks up, like, his walking stick and just, like, smashes it over the protagonist.
Totally breaks it over him, in the first strike.
Yeah. Grabs the cake and just runs off.
Well, and it's cool, too, because, like, leading up to that, when, like, the protagonist offers him a piece of cake, too, like, the guy, like, is he's being watched, so he still has to fake being blind, and he starts, like, crumbling the cake in his hand,
right?
And it's like this really weird kind of feeling. Like, you get, like, the protagonist, like, looking over him, like, what the fuck is this old guy doing? Like, I hand him a piece of cake, and he's like,
it's fucking mess
of it, and he's like eating like the crumbled parts out of his hand.
It's like he's going through it looking for
something. Exactly. And it's cool that, like, that latter knowledge, and, like, but in the moment it feel like, out of context, it feels so strange. And and so then he bashes him over the head and runs off into the bombed, like, regions that are being currently bombed, during the Blitz.
Exactly.
And so you get this really nice, like, kind of no man's land, like, set piece.
Cratered, fields and like the ruins of, like, bombed out, like, huts and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I did think it was funny that, like, our protagonist just, like, runs off right after him. Like, if a blind dude bashed me over the head with a cane and, like, took my cake, I'd be like, damn,
keep the cake, bro.
God, okay. But he just, like,
it's a good cake, but Jesus,
like, he just, like, runs off after. It's like, I'm gonna get you.
Yeah.
And we've got the scene of, like,
it's the principle of the thing.
Yeah, the blind dude takes out his pistol and he's, like, shooting at him, and he's hiding out in the little bombed out hut, and then it just gets a bomb dropped
directly on it. So, like, the old fake blind man just gets immediately detonated, like, as a bomb gets dropped on the cabin, and so the protagonist is just incredibly confused at that
and
moment.
It's like in the first 15 minutes of the movie, like, it's a great way to start, like, the whole intrigue thing. Like, fake blind man gets demolished by Nazi bomb.
Yeah, so I love it. Like, and that's the thing. Is the pacing of this film really holds up, I think. Like, beat for beat, like, it doesn't take too much time moving from scene to scene, and the events scene to scene are pretty fun as well and intriguing.
I agree for the most part. I think it starts to get a little bit convoluted midway through. It starts to, for me, it comes across as a little bit too much like, the intrigue, like the mystery seems a little bit too twisty and turny to really be, like, super cohesive.
You can say contrived. It's okay.
It's a bit contrived.
To the point where it's contrived, I think, is a good word for it, because you have moments where you're like, there should be some effect to what's happening right now, and they're just being very blasé about some of the things that are happening.
You've got a lot of characters that look kind of similar. I mean, I guess a lot of people in the 40s just kind of look the same. There's definitely a few moments where I'm like, wait, who is that person? Is that such and such or such and such? Right,
well, because the majority of the key characters are all academics, and so they're all just, like, guy in suit, sometimes glasses, and it can be kind of hard to pick them out.
Right, and you've got, like, a couple of different, like, beautiful blonde ladies who are hot for the protagonist.
True.
I had a hard time keeping them straight a little bit.
And the fun part too is, like, so does the protagonist. Like, because one of the upcoming sequences in the film is he goes to a seance. There's a few other key events that happen for him, but we'll skip over. To try and find the fortune teller. who originally gave him the proper weight for the cake. Because clearly, like, she's affiliated in some way with this spy ring. Yeah. And when he goes there to meet Madame Belle?
Madame Belaine or something like that?
Yeah, it's something very close to that here. Yeah, Belaine. You're right. God damn it. All right, so they go to a seance. And he goes there to find Mrs. Belaine, the fortune teller. But the person who comes out is
a different
person.
Yeah.
And so, hence, another piece of like the general confusion in this film. And she invites him and his associates in to join in this seance. And it's my favorite scene in the film.
Mine too, and I think it is the closest scene in the film to being any sort of horror whatsoever.
Yes.
Like, we stray from, like, straight up horror sometimes, but I think the seance is, like, the only spooky scene in the movie. I think the way it's executed is, even for a 44 film, it's still pretty spooky.
Yeah, it definitely got me. Like,
it's eerie, it's moody. I liked that quite a bit.
Yeah, like, the lighting is just fan-fucking-tastic, and I loved the set too, like with the high vault ceiling and those like cobra like candelabras.
Well, yeah, and like the table they're sitting around has like that like Chinese dragon that's holding like an orb that during the seance the light just comes from the orb.
And then if you notice the mosaic patterning in the floor was like based around a zodiac as well.
Yeah,
like, and all the chairs are lining around it. Like, just all sorts of like cool like aesthetics that I'm all about.
Yeah, no, I thought that was very cool. And to have like the whispering of the spirit during the seance, that you can't really understand it at first, but then as it goes on, it gets louder and more comprehensible.
Yeah, and it's cool because like Madame Belaine is sort of like channeling the spirit, and like it's this great moment too because you see like the main character is kind of like not wanting to like hold hands in the circle with all of these strangers when he's in the midst of this like this intrigue,
right?
And like very legitimate reason. So it's a nice like tension moment where he's sort of rendered like vulnerable. The lighting is really neat how it keys in on each of the characters like as it focuses in on them, but like clearly the lights are still dark in the room, and it's just this cool like kind of set dressing way of like bringing out certain elements in the scene. Very noir. When you start hearing like Madame Belaine like channeling the ghost whispering, and she starts saying, you were waiting for the ticking of the clock, and like she keys back into like the opening theme of the film, and she says a couple of specifics, and she calls out Stephen, our protagonist in particular, and that's when he starts like shouting and screaming, and then a gunshot goes off and the lights come on and you get your good old whodunit,
Right, someone has been murdered.
Yeah.
Yes. Stephen still has the gun that he uncovered from the old blind man on him at the time. So like they're like, hey, look, he has a gun. He's like, yeah, but I didn't shoot anything. Like, it has the same number of bullets in it, which is 1. Oh, gee.
Right.
Yep, they think I did it. Not great.
Shucks.
So, from the help of one of his compatriots, who he manages to escape. And so he's once again a man on the run. Or for the first time, I guess he's a man on the run now from the law and from this unknown ministry.
My question here, do we want to get into that conversation about, because this is the most horror adjacent element of the movie, about considering this a horror movie?
I would say it crosses over into horror.
Okay, sure, yeah.
I don't know if that's enough, but definitely. It is for me. But
yeah, it's definitely occult themed. Yeah. In a lot of ways, I see a lot of those seance elements as very noir themed as well.
Sure.
And the overlap is a little hazy. But I would love to hear some of your opinions a bit more on
it's a simple
how you
one.
consider this horror.
All I did was just went to Wikipedia and found like the Wikipedia definition for horror film.
Oh, sure.
I figured that's the best place you can start.
Yeah.
And it says a horror film is a film that seeks to elicit fear. It's initially inspired by, such literature as Poe, Stoker, Shelley, etc. Horror existed as a film genre for more than a century. The macabre and supernatural are frequent themes. Horror may also overlap with fantasy, supernatural fiction, and thriller genres, which it does in this case. So,
Totally.
I figured that's That's all I had.
I mean,
on it.
Ministry of Fear.
Yeah, exactly.
It's definitely a film of a different era, but I would say that this film is kind of horror in the same way that something like Silence of the Lambs is horror, even though Silence of the Lambs may be more overtly terrifying. Like it's ultimately like a murder mystery drama, like a police thriller. And it's got some very unsettling moments. And I think that, Ministry of Fear is kind of the same. Like, it is a film of 1944, so, like, the genre has changed and updated a lot. And, it's sometimes hard to consider films this old, like, scary at all. But I think that if you look at it in the context of when it was released...
Exactly.
And the kind of thing that Fritz Lang had been doing otherwise... I think that audiences in 1944 would probably have found that seance scene pretty creepy to sit in the theaters and watch that. Like, I think it would have elicited probably the same kind of reaction that we get from a lot of modern horror films.
I definitely think it's horror adjacent.
Yeah.
That's for sure. And the thing about genres are, I think they're very fluid.
Extremely.
Oh, yeah.
Like, they're not set in stone, they're very gray areas, they overlap more than anything else. So, like, I didn't bring that up to disagree with you. I just wanted to hear your opinion on some of that since it was your pick.
Oh, most definitely. And, like, I'll go as far as to say, like, if you had to just put one genre on it, it would be crime noir. Like, it wouldn't be horror.
Yeah.
But it definitely crosses over into it well enough. And I hope that's enough for the podcast, for sure.
I mean, like I said, we have strayed away from, your general, like, dinner table horror before,
Horror adjacent.
Yeah,
totally
horror adjacent.
fine.
I mean, even, like, when we just did The Vanishing a couple of weeks ago, it's the same kind of thing. Like, it's not a particularly scary movie, but it definitely has some themes and elements of horror that make it horror adjacent enough that, it bears talking about. And, considering that Fritz Lang did come out of the school of German Expressionism and stuff like that, which is, a huge root of the horror film genre, with a lot of those early examples of German Expressionism, like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and, like, Vampire, and Nosferatu, and, like, The Phantom Carriage and shit like that. But, by that point in his career, he was not in Germany for obvious reasons.
Here's a fun question. Would you consider Metropolis to fall into the genre? I think I would. I think it's pretty existential. I think in the same way that Ministry of Fear would. Like, it's not really a horror film, but it has some elements. It's definitely more sci-fi than horror. Oh, of course. In the same way this is more thriller, but it definitely crosses over. I mean, like,
it has some examples.
Everything to do with the automaton, it's very, like, it's pretty spooky.
Yeah.
It's definitely a stretch, but that's not to say horror elements don't exist within it.
Yeah.
I think the difference is it's horror adjacent. There's horror elements of it, but I would really have to stretch to categorize Metropolis as a horror movie, in my opinion.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, like,
it's definitely sci-fi.
Like, the existential themes, like, carry through the main plot.
You know?
Like, that is, like, one of the most like focal aspects of it. So, yeah, I don't know. I'd have to get back into it. I'd have to, like, watch it again to see. But I feel like those threads can be tied throughout the whole thing. But yeah, anyway. Well, let's see. What other key points do we have in the film? The two other primary characters are the what is their name? What is
the
it?
Hilfas.
Yes, the Hilfas, the Hilfa siblings, and they're running
a charity
organization called the what is it? The Mothers
of Free Nations.
Free Nations.
I believe.
Yes, Mothers of the Free Nations.
And that was the at the festival where he got the cake. That was the charity that was doing the cake weighing contest. That's how he got wrapped up with them. When he got to London, he went to their office to try to find the fortune teller's address.
Yes, and so he meets Willie and Carla Hilfa, And they are Austrian refugees who have since, moved to London or escaped to London and set up their little charity.
And their last name means helpful or help.
And they certainly are.
Because they're charitable people. The Hilfers.
Yeah. So they assist in whatever way they can, and we get a number of sequences of Stephen interacting with Carla. And them, inevitably falling in love.
That is probably my least favorite thing about this movie.
I agree fully.
The shoehorned romance that has no place in the actual story. They just had to do it because it was 1944 and you couldn't have a film without a romantic subplot.
Man, and in the tradition of noir, I was just hoping that it was going to be like a femme fatale type of character.
Yeah,
with
but
the
it's
double
not
cross.
at all.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Like, I think that the femme fatale is pretty overbaked, even 1944 at that point. Like, I'm not saying that I enjoyed or preferred that, but like, I'm not sure if a femme fatale would have been the right answer.
I mean,
for that.
I think it would have
Like,
made her more of a well-rounded
Yeah.
character than just simply being a love interest,
Well, we do have like the femme fatale character in Madame Boleyn as well. So that would have been
somewhat. But
yes,
I mean, that's
outside of the seance, she doesn't play that much of a role.
well,
in the
actually,
film.
you were out of the room at the time, but the sequence when he returns back to her flat has one of my favorite shots in it. They're sitting on a sort of a couch, and to her right is her purse. And the main character is just trying to do as much digging as he can, and he's talking to her, and he's got his arm up and around the back of the couch. And while they're having dialogue, which is nice because the dialogue itself is like multi-layered. There's a lot of like double entendre referring back to like the spy organizations and such, and like telling futures and things. He's also reaching over and like checking her bag, and sure enough, he sees like a small handgun in there, and it's all done in one shot too, and like it feels very genuine, like she wouldn't recognize that like he's fishing through her bag during it. So it looks like it's a really nice like sleight of hand play, and I enjoying roguish characters like thought that was quite well done, and I'd love to know how many shots that took, because you have to get the dialogue right and also like get that sleight of hand in there. Yeah. So I thought that was a cool moment in the story, and it's great too because like that ends once he's like got the gun in his hand, he's checked it. She calls his bluff on it and says, "You're not going to find any bullets in there." And it's cool that like she was aware of it the whole time. It makes her like a fairly powerful character. But anyway, going back to the Hilfa siblings and the love arc there, Stephen and Carla are trying to solve more of the mystery, and they end up having to escape into a what's the term? A protective area during the raid.
Well, yeah, a bomb shelter.
Yes.
But they're in a subway.
That's right. It's just a subway station. Underground, and they're with a
bunch of other people.
Yeah, so they're in the huddled masses awaiting, the inevitable bomb strikes. And during that sequence, Stephen gives us a little bit of exposition on why he was in an asylum, and we learn that he is just inherently a sympathetic character and one that we can trust as a narrator, which I liked. I liked that the twist was actually he is a good person
to an extent. Honestly, one of my favorite elements of the movie is there's a point where he goes back into the hospital, and the Scotland Yard, I believe it is, comes in to question him, and he's giving them this whole story, and they're just like, "You're insane, you're crazy, you're just imagining this." And a very brief time in the movie, there is a little question being put into the reality of the events of the movie before that, whether it was in his mind as a fantasy.
Well, and I think that though he does reveal to Carla like why he was in the asylum, that his wife was like terminally ill, and she kept asking him to like put her out of her misery. So he eventually like went to the drugstore and got some shit and essentially performed a mercy killing.
Yeah. Well, no, the thing is he got the drugs, like he got the poison to kill her, but then couldn't follow through with it. She found it and did it herself. And
That's right.
And I liked that because like it still makes, again, like he couldn't do it. He wanted to like put her out of her misery and help her, but like it was just too hard for him, and he couldn't bring himself through to do with it. But his wife did it for him and did it anyway.
But my point is, is that we don't ever see this through flashback or anything, so it's just
we still don't know, is what you're saying.
Yes, that's my point. It's like it's just
and Ben's
his
point too,
it's just his word. So it's like, well, while he is convincing, there's still that bit of doubt. Like, dude was in an asylum. Like, is this story that he's telling true, or did he actually murder his wife? You know, and while it's like never really addressed, it's pretty obvious that like he is innocent. I do still like that sort of speculative nature, especially when he is being questioned by the
Scotland Yard.
inspector from Scotland Yard. Because, like, they're like, yeah, we know what you did. Like, we know that it was, quote-unquote, a mercy killing, but you're still in an asylum. You're still crazy. Like, you're still not reliable.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, he's kind of not. He kind of still isn't reliable.
Exactly.
Even though he's telling the truth about the Nazi spy ring, like, he's not a particularly reliable character, and I like that.
I wish we had more of that, to be honest. Because I think... The time before they, you know, go back to find the cake and discover it is pretty brief, you know, in the movie. And having the prior events of the movie put into question as a sort of the camera being an unreliable narrator because it's, you know, from the perspective of the main character's fantasies is a super cool idea, you know. And unreliable narrators in film aren't super common, especially during that time. So they had elements of that in there, and they worked super well when they were in there. I just wanted more of it, honestly.
And what I will say is that once, I like how, like, for a good chunk of the film, like, we see the Scotland Yard investigator, like, pursuing the protagonist, but he thinks he's part of the Nazi spy ring because he's just, like, this mysterious man in black who keeps, like, showing up, and he narrowly escapes him. Like, the twist that, he's a police detective all along! Like, that's fun, but I liked that element of intrigue, and once the guy reveals himself to be the inspector, and then there's, like, that last good chunk of the movie where dude is just going around with Scotland Yard being like, yeah, investigate this.
Investigate this.
Investigate this.
True.
I thought that took a lot of the good drama out of it. Like, I wish it was, I would have liked it better if he escaped from Scotland Yard. Like, they didn't believe him.
Still a man on the run, trying to prove himself.
Trying to... That good old thing, like, he's still on the run from both the law and the spy ring, and he has to clear his own name, and he has to stop the spy ring by himself, because ultimately it does just end up being Scotland Yard.
So saves the day, yeah.
It ends up a little too cleanly.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Like,
no, I agree. Like, and two, like, when he's they return to the bomb site, and, like, they're pointing out the stuff. One of my favorite little things about it was, they're just searching for the remnants of the cake to see, like, what was in the cake, and they get out, like, shovels, and they're trying to filter, like, the sand to see if they can find any cake or whatever. And there's a callback to the birds being in the area, and the main protagonist, like, right before they're about to just clean up shop and call it a day and just, you know, like, blame everything on the protagonist after all, he says, wait a minute, and he runs up to the bird's nest, and he grabs a massive piece of the cake box out of this little bird's nest.
Yeah.
like
strong bird.
Like, these little sparrows could just pick up like half a cake box and, like, put it in this tiny nest.
Bird ex machina.
Yeah.
I just imagine, like, 6 birds, like, carrying it like people do a coffin. It's
or like in a Disney movie. Like,
well, and that the microfilm that was hidden in the cake that will clear his name did just so happen to be in that one piece of cake that the birds
which I love
taken.
too. Like, it could have the piece of microfilm was like the little capsule of Michael film. The little capsule of microfilm was so small, like, it could have just had a little bit of cake on it and been in the bird's nest, and we would have bought that.
Right.
Like, instead they had to have this huge piece of the cake box in there. But yeah, you find that the microfilm is like plans, like attack plans.
Routes of attack for the Nazis to successfully invade England.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was England's attack plan, and then they were trying to smuggle it out.
That's what it was. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and we were talking about like what we would have wanted out of this movie. We brought that up a couple of times.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good reason to bring up why I picked this film, and one of the things that I do really like about this movie, and also classic films in general, as because we have a greater scope of cinema to look back at this film on, like we have a much larger lens to inspect it with than the film had at the time. It gives us a really cool opportunity to see like a lot of these like cool ideas that might necessarily have been done as well as they could have at the time, or even not. Like, you don't have to blame the time, just it could have been done even then. We can take those ideas and do something with them, like else, and like imagine what they could have been ourselves. And I think that can be worthy of a watch by itself. Whether the actual film it's like meets like that 10 out of 10 or not, like I still think it can be a valid watch to gain like insight. Because again, like this film actually does pull off a lot of those great things as well, but it definitely doesn't pull off all of them. And it makes a couple of blunders. But I think that in a modern setting, like with those blunders removed, you could have a really, really comparable film even today.
I think the really cool part of that too, especially watching older films on the show, is you get to see what legacies of technique and style have endured.
Yeah.
Especially and evolved in a lot of ways in terms of
bringing it back to the source
and stuff like that. But you also see what has aged badly.
Yes.
And
it's equally fun too.
Like with a lot of new movies, we don't get that benefit of time that a lot of these movies have. And a lot of these movies, or at least some of them, have not aged super well, and
I would say most
lesser movies for it. But you can still glean a lot of evolution out of them. Of technique, of style, of
you can
theme.
Observe the history of it.
Yeah.
I think another thing about this movie too is that maybe to its detriment, like Fritz Lang at this point in his career already had so many bangers under his belt that like when such an accomplished director like Fritz Lang makes a film that's not a masterpiece, I think it also kind of has
right, because you're comparing it to the masterpieces. You're comparing it to
other, like, because you know what he's capable of. So it's like when he doesn't accomplish that on every film, that I think it makes it a little bit harder to forgive. Not that this is a bad film, but I do think that in the context of some of his other work, it does fall short in several aspects.
Yeah, and I think in some ways this movie is a victim of its time in a lot of ways, because this is during the time period where the Hays Code of movie censorship outright in the United States was at its strongest and strictest.
Yeah.
That's why we have such a clean ending. That's why we have that romance directly in it. That's why we don't see actual direct violence on screen.
And I mean, also, like, this movie came out in 1944, like, the war was still on. Like, it was taking place in present day for the people who are watching it. So
right, which makes that tension just all the higher.
Right at the time, and also why they ended it so cleanly.
Right, that resolution's kind of needed.
Because how pessimistic would it have been to have it to have it end with the Nazi spy ring winning? In 1944 in the UK,
absolutely not.
When they were actively being blitzed, to have them not beat the Nazis.
That's the thing too. At the time, audiences were looking for strong, clear-cut heroes and villains. That's why the hero, even though he had a dark, ambiguous past, that's why they very much limited that ambiguity to as small of an amount as possible.
Well, by the end of the film, yes.
Yes.
For sure. Like, by the end of the film, it is very clear he is your clean-cut protagonist.
Right.
But, it's cool that, like, they're seeing the evolution of that throughout the film, for sure. Like, at least there's a neat arc there. I'll just conclude the plot, and then I do want to get back into the forced romance part, because there's some giggles in there.
Let's do it.
But to conclude the plot line, after they find the microfilm, they go back to the big boss generals. We get some cool sets there of like the big battle plans and world maps and things. The Scotland Yard goes to find one of the tailor, or one of the people at the seance, to bring them in. Steven, our protagonist, goes in first to kind of scope the place out, with Scotland Yard ready to go in at any time. We see the villain make a phone call and order a suit, obviously some sort of code, and then recognizing that he's surrounded, runs into a back room and commits scissor coup. And
kills himself with some big old scissors.
Yeah.
And
I like it too because like during the sequence, like when he's dialing the phone, like he's dialing it with the scissors, and you think like he could just like try and stab the protagonist or something.
Well, the thing is too, it's like I didn't pick up immediately on the fact that he had killed himself because like he just runs into the back room and then they take their sweet time breaking the window and they get back there and he's just impaled on the scissors. So my natural first instinct was that he was doing what you're not supposed to do and he was running
with scissors and just died.
He was running with scissors and he tripped and he impaled himself on the scissors, which I think is a lot more fun.
What I love too is that the ambiguity is still there for that to have been what happened.
Yeah.
Like he was running into the back room to get a Tommy gun or something and just offed himself accidentally.
He just tripped on the scissors.
I kind of prefer that. It's more there's more realism there.
It's definitely funnier.
Yeah. So our protagonist, like during those events, he quickly like redials the phone. He asks the operator to call back, and
well, no, when the guy's dialing it, he memorizes the number that he's dialing. We see him mouthing.
Oh
it.
yeah, which is great too. It's well done because like it looks like the protagonist would make sure to like mouth the numbers out like whenever the guy isn't looking, and so we get that really nice back and forth, very Hitchcockian.
Yeah.
Because of course they're having a conversation in the middle of that too.
Right.
Like it's just a number of nice like layers. Anyway, our protagonist redials that number, and Carla, his love interest, answers the phone. Oh no! So he goes back to confront, and of course Carla is innocent in this scenario, but her brother,
Willie Ilfa.
Willie Ilfa.
Willie help.
Yep. Willie help?
Willie help?
Turns out he won't. And so we learned that of course the character most primed to be running the spy ring is running the spy ring.
Of course, the Austrian refugee is the secret Nazi.
Yeah. Surprise, surprise.
Who would have guessed?
Like, at least like the other Austrian refugee isn't. Like, I guess that helps. Like,
well, yeah,
it doesn't help from like a plot perspective, but at least it helps from like a representative perspective.
I think she was definitely culpable. She might not have been like, she might not have liked what they were doing, but it's not like she was actively working against Willie until the end when she has to kill him because now she's in love with our protagonist.
Well, I thought it was
love saves the day.
Well, I thought like she was unaware. Like she actually didn't realize that.
Is that what happened? Because it seemed to me that she knew what was happening.
Yeah, I don't know.
I could be wrong. They didn't.
I give
it's
some
been a
of
few days since we
that
watched
stereotypical stuff a pass because Fritz Lang himself was a refugee. You know, so
well, right, obviously, which is why I did think it was funny that the refugee turned out to be the secret Nazi, because you'd think that Fritz Lang would make it definitely not the Austrian refugee.
Yeah, he's
him being
like
one,
painting a target on his own back.
Right, it's like, wait a second, the dude with the accent was the villain all along. Maybe Fritz Lang is a Nazi spy.
Yeah, which was interesting. I do love how that sequence ends with like our protagonist and Willie are in a battle, like like the hand to hand with the guns, and he wrestles it out of his hand, and it gets knocked out of the hand, and she picks it up, of course, and the brother, seeing the sister with the gun, cuts the lights and runs out of the room, and he says, "You wouldn't shoot your brother, would you?" And we get the bang, and because he cuts off the lights, the door opens, so we get him silhouetted in the door in typical noir fashion, and then closing the door into darkness, we get the line, and then the bang, and you just get the hole of light through the door. Like, it's great. Like, I love the light, and then the door like swings back open, or he goes in over and opens it, I forget, and the brother's dead there on the ground, and you see this beautiful like comic book like panel to panel framing, like this one shot of all the sequences. It's fucking awesome.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. And then he has the shootout with the other Nazis on the roof of the hotel in the rain, which is a cool set piece, especially because like we see like the rooftop doorway, and the staircase is like in darkness, and it's only lighting up like when the Nazis inside are shooting. I thought that was really cool visual. But then, surprise, Scotland Yard comes along and just shoots all the Nazis, and the day is saved.
Yeah, Deus Ex Scotland, Yardica.
Yeah.
But yes, they show up, and we get the resolution scene of the film. But I want to come back to that because that'll nicely wrap up our biggest problem with the movie,
Yeah.
which I think is a fun way to end it. Because like we've talked about how much we love the film, you know, the things we liked about the film. Like let's get into the other stuff too. Like first off, several of the sequences, like with. Do you want to like bring up some of that stuff? Because I could see it got to you guys too. Like,
Well, what stuff specifically?
the love stuff.
Oh yeah. Oh man. The part that made me groan the most was like when we see Carla back at the office of like the charity with her brother, and they're talking about Steven, and her brother's like brother's like, "You're not falling in love with him, are you?" and she's like, "Yes, very much," or something like that. I'm just like, God damn it, of course she is.
Yeah.
Like, because she has to. She can't just be helping him out because she thinks he's innocent, or she, you know, is concerned about the implications of what he's suggesting. She has to be helping him because she's got the hots for him. And that shit has aged the least well about the movie.
And the weird
because
thing
it's such a fucking 40s
is-
thing to do.
Well,
Yeah, it
the
is.
thing is, like, I've seen a lot of noir movies that don't do that. You know, even from the same period, you know, from the 40s and the 50s, even some from the late 30s. And I think...
Well, yeah, my favorite noir films don't.
Yeah, exactly. So when I see it happening here, it's all the more disappointing. Because I think noir is one of those genres from that generation that has aged pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
No,
a lot
honestly,
of,
I agree.
there's a lot of
I don't think it's
strong
necessarily a problem
female
of the time.
characters,
Yeah. Like it's a mechanism that was used a lot in the time that hasn't aged well.
Well, and I think
But,
I
like,
think a lot
yeah.
of I think a lot of that also goes into what I was saying before about like the film needing to have like a hopeful outcome, considering that its subject matter and the time that it was released. It's coming out during the war about a Nazi spy ring infiltrating Britain during the Blitz. Like, they need to have that shit end as happily and cleanly as possible, and not only having the Nazi spy ring defeated, but also having our protagonist get the girl, you know, like that's that added level of hopefulness that I think that they would have wanted to go for. So I get it. In 2019 watching it, I think it's shoehorned and it's
What the thing
awful.
though, I'll say is like it's shoehorned it awful, but I really enjoyed laughing at it. Like I from like an unintentional from the director's perspective point, I thought it was really funny, and I didn't hate that it was in the movie. Like I thought it was really bad, but I enjoyed getting a laugh out of it.
See, I agree with Tease on like how it was almost required for the movie in this, you know,
It feels forced.
year
Yeah.
specifically. It hasn't aged well.
Yeah.
You know, obviously, I think we can all agree with that. I have a speculative question for you guys.
Okay.
Sure.
And I think it brings some interesting discussion. How do you think this movie would be different if it was released 5 years later? Say it was released in 49 instead of 44. Because I think the story itself could still have easily have been,
Yeah.
you know, released in 49.
I should. I mean, you could release it last year. Like, yeah. Like, I'm
not sure. I think it still probably would have been pretty similar, but it might not have been as afraid to take a somewhat more pessimistic approach. I'm not sure how, you know, because by that time, and I mean this is a UK production, not an American production, but by 49, getting into the 50s, you know, like the Cold War is starting. So there's like a whole different array of fears.
yeah.
You know,
And
like
spy intrigue
the-
is just as relevant.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know if it would have been if it had been released 5 years later. I almost wonder if it would have been Soviet-centric rather than Nazi-centric.
I think at that point though, like we're looking at such a different film. One of my favorite aspects of it is that it's set during the Blitz. I think like that's such just a fantastic.
And I
It's a
think
good-
you could
it's a good
easily
setting, yeah.
Yeah.
Release a World War II movie in 49 about the same
thing.
events,
Yeah,
you
that's
know?
yeah, I agree.
You wouldn't even have to reappropriate it to it.
I don't
to
think so at all.
Russians at all. You
No,
know?
no.
I think the reason it brings up some interesting discussions, it really emphasizes the structural limitations of releasing it in 44. Imagining
Yeah.
it in another time really emphasizes what limits it because of that time period.
That being
you know?
said, I also wonder, had it been released 5 years later, in the wake of World War II, with Europe recovering, because by 49, Europe was absolutely still in like a major recovery process from the damage of the war. Mm-hmm. I almost wonder if this same story would have been released at all. I think that when you look at a lot of other similar noir thrillers and stuff of the era, it almost seems like some filmmakers were afraid to go back into the wartime so recently because it's still so fresh in everybody's mind and it was such a horrible time. I think that by having this film released in 44 during the war, it's not really, but it's almost like pro-England propaganda, kind of. Just in the sense that the Nazis are thwarted by, like, good British police work,
Mm-hmm.
to not even have the protagonist do it, but to have, like, Scotland Yard save the day. The Brits triumphing over the Nazis, It's that message of hope that they needed during that particularly dark time. And, in 49, they might have said, like, shit, like, this wound is still fresh. I don't know if people are really trying to relive this time.
I'd be curious to see the numbers on that. Like,
I have no idea.
That's my thing. Is like statistically, we'd need to see like the release of World War II themed films.
That's totally speculative.
Yeah, and I think the answer would lie in that for sure.
No, it's totally speculative.
There definitely were movies about the war.
Sure.
In 48 and 49, and some of them even more movies.
Yeah.
I definitely agree that it would have had the possibility of being a little more pessimistic. I think on top of that, in noir, it would have leaned more on noirish structures of having more ambiguous characters.
Yes.
Where I think this movie was very clear-cut, good and bad.
Yeah, because it needed to have good and bad
because that was
guys.
Necessary for the time.
I think you're right.
And I wonder if it would have been better for that.
It could have been. I think our protagonist would have probably been an edgier character had this been released a few years later. I think you're right. I think there would have been more of those blurred lines. It wouldn't have been so clean-cut, good versus evil.
Yeah.
For sure. So do you want to talk about the final sequence
and
how great it is? Oh man, if y'all could see like the look on Tisa's face, just like the fatigue of like what that had been too, for that matter. Like
it was just the worst way to end this movie.
Yeah, it was quite bad.
It was so bad.
I love it though.
I mean, the fact that it feels so abrupt and so much hokey and of an afterthought that it goes directly, with no sort of transition, directly from the dreary, rainy rooftop scene. The last of the Nazis are gunned down. We see the Scotland Yard folks come up onto the roof, like, yeah, we got them, boys.
Looks like good old police work did it.
Right, exactly. And then it cuts directly from that to Steven and Carla
driving in a convertible, like the California coastline.
Like, on the countryside.
The violins are playing.
Some of the most dated rear projection I have seen in a while.
Yeah, and
the time, like, Jesus.
What does she say? Something about...
Oh, she's just like, at our wedding, like, can you imagine what kind of cake we're gonna get? And then he turns around and he goes,
like, cake? Oh my god.
I loved it.
I hated it so much.
It's so bad. I love it.
It's such... It reminded me of Some Like It Hot, kind of, in that, like, ending quip. You gotta have a quip at the end. But this one just felt, like, so tacked on.
But it's also, like, that is so, I think, symptomatic of, like, the time. Because, like, we haven't talked about it on the show, but, like, Night of the Hunter has a similarly corny, hackneyed, happy ending conclusion that, like, is, in my opinion, the only bad thing about that film. And I won't get into that because we're definitely going to talk about that film on this show, but
it's great too, because like for this film, like that piece of dialogue just implies that like the greatest scar that the events of the film gave upon our main character is he has PTSD about cake. Like that's like the biggest wound he took away from this, because like nothing was going to match what had already happened to him with his dead wife. Like,
right.
You know,
But
like,
no,
the biggest thing is
he
hates fucking cake now.
Yeah, now he can't abide by the sight of cake. Yeah. God, no, that shit pissed me off. It's probably the only thing that legitimately frustrated me about this movie.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I thought it was fun and solid, and maybe it wasn't quite as tight as some of Fritz Lang's other stuff, but that was the only thing that really angered me.
Yeah. Just felt so super tacked on.
Oh
Yes,
yeah, for
dude.
sure. So that's the last of the points, sir.
Yeah, you want to
from
go
that.
ahead and rate it?
Rate
I think
it.
we're at a good point. Why don't you start, Cleveland?
Yeah, well, like I said, apart from those final groaners, from me, like, I enjoyed the set of it. I personally didn't even mind that like the protagonist was a little bit more like clean cut, and especially considering like the time and why the film has so many great. So many great concepts in it that I find to be very inspiring with the seance sequence. And again, the direction is just out of this world. The cinematography like kicks ass because it's noir. It's a hallmark of the genre. I'm gonna give it a good old 3.5. I really liked it, and it has a lot of cool ideas, and a number of them it pulls off with aplomb as well. But man, the hokey bits are pretty hokey, and it falters here and there.
No, I'm pretty much right where you are. Like I think that the plot gets a little bit convoluted and a little bit too twisty and turny to really be like have tight narrative focus for like a spy thriller. Like I think a lot of times people equate like spy thrillers with like confusing plots, and like that's not the way you do a good spy thriller. But I didn't think it was too bad in this. I think it had a lot of great set pieces. I would say that seance scene, like we talked about, is more effective than a lot of modern horror seance scenes, just at least in like the tone and the mood of it and like the execution. I think it's really well done, especially for a film of that era. And I thought this was a pretty fun, relatively inoffensive film. And I think that it's good for what it is, but it does fall short from being what Fritz Lang is capable of. I'm going to give it a 3.5 too. That's right where I'm at.
Definitely, yeah. I think this is a really solid film noir movie. Fritz Lang is a master. I think what keeps it from being a great movie, and just keeps it as a solid movie, it's a victim of a few things. So it's a victim of being in Fritz Lang's filmography. So honestly, because of that, we're automatically gonna hold it up to a very high standard. It's also a victim of its time, like we were talking about before. It's kind of limited by wartime, censorship codes, having clear-cut heroes and villains. In a similar way, it's held back by the noir that came after it. So the noir of the late 40s were much more ambiguous. And I think that made stuff more three-dimensional than stuff of this time because of the morals. And because of that, I think some of the limitations of ambiguity in this movie kept it from going to places it could have gone. I think what it is, however, is really strong. Some of those set pieces with the moody noirish lightings are really awesome. Really one of a kind. I love that scene where it's just complete darkness once they close the door. You get the shots through the door. I thought that was awesome. I thought the shootout in the rain on the rooftop was really great. I think this is a solid movie. I would give it a 3.5 out of 5. I think we're in pretty much agreement here.
Cool.
Nice.
Hell yeah. Unanimous 3.5 out of 5. Also, I did look on IMDb, and there Fritz Lang is credited with directing 47 films.
Hot damn.
So not quite as high as we were thinking, but still.
That's just my memory being hyperbolic.
Almost 50. And he was doing more than one a year. Like Hitchcock has a similar output. Like that's still a lot of films.
It's outrageous.
To
it's an
direct in
outrageous
a
number.
lifetime.
Like,
yeah, absolutely. So that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, seriously. I want to give one shout out. If you guys have free time, I would definitely check out. There's an amazing, lengthy interview between the director William Friedkin and Fritz Lang. It happened in 1974.
Ooh, I'll be checking that out.
It's about an hour or two, and they really delve into the details of his upbringing, of his history with filmmaking, the background of Metropolis, of movies like M. They touch into movies like this a little bit. It came out in 1974, so it has the majority of his filmography behind him at that point. And William Friedkin himself is a fucking master. I mean, look at The Exorcist, you know?
Right.
Like, look at Sorcerer, look at Killer Joe or Bug.
Yeah, what a perfect person to be interviewing.
Yeah.
Like, God,
exactly.
I'll have to check that
Yeah,
out.
I think, man,
wow, what a cool recommendation.
Fritz Lang is a particularly interesting filmmaker to me, especially considering that, like, he started his career in, like, the German film industry,
Yeah.
which was huge and remained huge during the reign of the Nazis, but, like, to come out of that school of German expressionism and then, like, once the war started to
figure that shit out.
Be like, fuck this! I'm not going to stay in Germany and make Nazi propaganda films.
Yeah, exactly.
And how fascinating that is too, because like he was in like this perfect like prime position to benefit from that.
Right, largely. And to flee to the UK and continue his career, but making
it's a heroic move.
Both
it really is.
and Hitler were vocally huge fans of Metropolis.
Yeah.
Like they were trying to court him to make propaganda
like
movies.
If Fritz Lang had wanted to be a Nazi, he could have been a very successful Nazi.
Yeah.
And instead he chose to put his life on the line and flee and, keep making art for art's sake rather than make fucking hateful warmongering propaganda. And yeah, I think that's pretty fucking heroic, and like it also makes Fritz Lang a relatively unproblematic figure in film history from the era that he's from.
And not even excluding the era, that's a rarity in of its own.
True. So yeah, fucking dicks out for Fritz Lang. Is it time to enter that place?
You find yourself in a strange room. An academic circle. Every point you bring up is followed with a counterpoint. All you can see is disagreement. Nothing makes sense here. You have entered the hot take zone.
All right, what's our hot take for the week, Ben?
Okay, so I have a particularly spicy one, and I think it's one that fits in really well with the conversation we were having about genre categorization. So my hot take is thrillers are just horror movies with more restraint.
See, when you brought it up the other week, you phrased it a little differently, and I really like how you rephrased it.
I mean, I think I rephrased it pretty much the same. Maybe I flipped it around.
No, you said like thrillers don't have the balls that horror movie or something like that. It was like it was more of a call out on thrillers, whereas like this phrasing is a little bit more like, fitting.
But I mean, it's essentially the same. So
but restraint can be seen as a good thing. Like the framing is more positive towards thrillers, which I like. I like the way that you framed it.
I wrote it down in my phone. Is why I know.
I have an opinion, but before I do, I would like you to elaborate on what you mean by thrillers are horror films with more restraint.
Sure. Okay. So the idea.
I know what you mean, but like
as we were going into earlier, horror movies are based around fear and the idea of eliciting certain moods from audiences. And with thrillers, the MO is very similar. It's, eliciting tension and releasing, thrills from people. And they're very similar emotions. The only difference between tension and fear, in my opinion, is the amount you show a lot of times. The difference between a categorization of, say, Rear Window, for example. The reason that's not categorized as a horror movie is because we don't directly see the intimate details of what the killer does.
Right.
We get the tension of imagining that stuff.
Oh, yeah. No, I think I actually agree with that. I think that tension and anxiety are just kind of diet fear. Like fear, like true fear and horror is the far end of that same spectrum. like you go through feelings of tension and anxiety before you hit fear very quickly sometimes, but like it's it's definitely a curve. So in that sense, I will agree that they are trying to elicit similar feelings, but I don't know if I would really necessarily say that it's thrillers or horror films with more restraint, because I think there are plenty of thrillers that are wildly unrestrained, but they're not really horror.
Yes, and I have a point to bring into that, which delightfully muddies the water. And that is that there is another key aspect of that definition that we looked at earlier. And that's to do more with setting and thematic elements as well. And horror very often covers the macabre. And it doesn't always, though, and that's where things get muddy, right? Like, for sure, like you can have a modern day setting where there's nothing necessarily macabre related, but just centered around, for instance, like you're saying with Silence of the Lambs, like a serial killer, and that's plenty enough to make it a horror film.
I would say Silence of the Lambs is quite oriented on the macabre.
Though, yeah.
And
yeah,
that's
I don't
the
like
thing.
how I framed that.
I think if you displayed
Right.
Silence of the Lambs with enough restraint, it could easily be a psychological thriller rather than a horror.
Sure, and I think you can call it either a psychological thriller or a horror film and be right both times.
Yes. Well, and that's one of the shortcomings of genre categorizations in general. I think we talked about it a little bit earlier, but in particular, the thriller genre is one of the broadest genres in general. I would consider thrillers to fall in three main categories. So you have the action thrillers, the balls to the wall, action heavy movies. You have the crime thrillers that, may have elements of tension, fear, action, but they are crime oriented, focusing on crimes. Even noirs would often fall in that category. And then you have psychological thrillers, which are very much that diet horror. That horror with more restraint. It's not dropping the balls on the table,
Here's something that...
In the same way.
Here's something that I would say is you can't make it a 100% general statement, sure. But I think that an important distinction between horror and thriller is that a lot of the time in a thriller, the protagonist has more agency.
Yes, information.
Than in a horror movie. Whereas in most horror, once again, not all, but most horror, there is something happening to a person and they are trying to figure out a way out of it, usually futilely, and they're severely outmatched. In thrillers, typically you have a protagonist who's like an action hero or a detective or something, like somebody who has agency in
and is usually running one,
and they're not so much being acted upon by an external overwhelming force.
Right. It's the existentialism that
I
can
agree
really key
somewhat,
in, yeah.
But at the same time,
like I said, it's not a 100% blanket
there
statement.
are a lot of differences in there. And
Absolutely.
I think a keystone of thrillers in general are dramatic irony. And that means, having the story be a beat or two ahead of where the character is. And that limits the agency usually of the main character, even if he might not be completely trapped by a situation. There is that tension that arises of him not knowing the situation and being limited in his agency because of that.
Right. Well, I would say even something like, like The Vanishing, which we have agreed is more so a thriller than a horror film, but it does have a bit of that horror crossover. With something like The Vanishing, Rex has so much agency in that he is continually searching for Saskia, whereas if he decided to just walk away from the thing, he could, and he would come out okay.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Whereas his ultimate downfall is a result of his obsession and his agency. Mm-hmm. The horror is not so much being enacted upon him as he is chasing it to his own undoing.
What's really funny is I have a comparative on the other side of that scale that barely hits, and that's The Lady Vanishes, because the main character has little agency and is trapped on a train and can't get out. And I would say that film is a little bit more horror than thriller. because the information is being provided to her like as hardly as she can, and it's mostly her being caught up in the confusion of it. It's also one of my favorite, like, personal favorite Hitchcock films. I don't think it's like one of his best, but it's one that like I find near and dear.
I think another comparison that I would make is like Alien to Die Hard.
Oh yeah,
because I think they do have some similar aspects. Whereas like
they do.
In Alien, the crew collectively decides we have to hunt down and kill this thing before it kills us, yeah? But they are wildly outmatched. And the horror comes from, like, just how outmatched they are. Whereas in Die Hard, yeah, Bruce Willis is outmatched, but also he's a fucking badass.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, he's outmatched, but he's hunting down and killing these terrorists because he's a fucking action hero. I mean, they're obviously not one-to-one.
Well, let's unpack that a
but
little bit.
It's a fun comparative.
Let's unpack that a little bit. Do you think horror as a genre is more pessimistic, because of that amount to overcome?
I think it can be. I would say that most of the time, probably yes. There are plenty of horror films that end optimistically, and there are plenty of thriller films that are extremely pessimistic. Things like...
That's where the water gets really muddy, though.
Yeah, that is where the waters get muddied, but even so, like, I would say something like Old Boy. Old Boy is definitely a thriller film. It has maybe a little bit of horror crossover, but that is pretty decisively a thriller. It is extremely pessimistic. That being said, our protagonist is also a fucking badass. And I think that's why it's more of a thriller than it is a horror movie, because he has so much agency and so much power. Yet, the end of that movie is fucking hella depressing and extremely pessimistic. So I don't think that's necessarily the only differentiator between the two, but I think it's more like horror films have a certain set of principles and thriller films have a certain set of principles, and there's crossover between those, but I think what ultimately defines a story or a film as one or the other is how many principles of horror does it have versus how many principles of a thriller does it have. I think it's more like a sum of its parts thing rather than just like individual aspects.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think in almost all scenarios with thrillers, though, you could loosen the restraints and turn them into horror movies fairly easily. I mean, obviously, it becomes more of a stretch with action thrillers than it does with crime or psychological thrillers.
Well, yeah, because crime and psychological thrillers have a lot of that horror crossover. Like Silence of the Lambs has a lot of horror crossover. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo has a lot of horror crossover. At a certain point, it becomes...
Yeah. I mean, Sleeping Beauty has horror crossover. Like... or Snow White. No, sorry, Snow White. Yeah, has some like great horror crossover with the swamp scene. Like you can say.
Yeah, like I think that there's plenty of films that have a little bit of horror crossover. That are maybe not like truly horror films. I would say I agree with you for the most part, but I don't think that that's like a 100% like blanket statement. Like I just think of like really fucking balls to the wall action movies that are like super gory and super violent, that are like very much like action thriller movies and not horror films.
And I think that's
it
comes down to the problem of thriller as a genre being so broad.
It's like that. It's like a combination.
It's like 5 genres in one.
Yeah, that's true.
It's like a combination of like the lack of restraint with the blood and the gore, with the extreme pessimism, with also like the existential dread, also with like an overwhelming, seemingly unstoppable force. It's like all of these things added together contribute to making like a true horror film. And you start taking certain things away, it's like, okay, it's got some horror crossover, but it starts to become a different beast by mixing and matching those things.
Yeah, I think the Venn diagram is fairly close together, but like most movies aren't gonna have the full circle ever in either camp, So it's just using judgment, and like obviously those are very broad categorizations, and like doesn't make anything less of a movie.
Yeah, for
know?
sure. But I mean, I think there are plenty of decidedly one or the other. Like I would challenge just about anybody to turn a Fast and Furious movie into a horror film. You know, just by
Challenge accepted.
Just by like turning up the restraint, or you know, turning a film like The Witch into you know, not a horror film and into like a psychological thriller, you know. Like I think there's plenty of films on both sides that are decisively one or the other.
Yeah, Fast and the Furious is a pretty solid example for thriller exclusively.
Like I said before, it's a lot of elements that add up to making them those things. It's not just one single aspect.
And that's the thing, you know, I think those movies are very much action movies, you know? And thriller is part of that by nature.
Right, but but that's the thing. Action is thrilling, but horror is also thrilling.
Exactly.
A thriller is an extremely broad term because...
I mean, thrill just means excitement, like if we're being real.
Right.
Like in an amusement park, like a category for like a churner or whatever they call them, like the twisting eggs or whatever, is a thrill ride, right?
Right, like thrilling implies an adrenaline rush, and you could be getting that adrenaline rush from having such a good time or from being scared senseless, you know, like those sensations are both thrilling but in different ways.
Yeah.
I have a slight tangent. If I was to turn Fast and Furious into a horror movie,
I've been thinking about that already.
I would just have villains that are super into just getting the characters into awful gory crashes, or like saw traps built out of cars and stuff, like booby-trapped cars.
Isn't that Drive?
Or have like a speed... No.
Or like Drive Angry.
Or like a speed situation where they can't slow down.
Speed! Sorry, that's what I was thinking of.
Speed is one of the funniest movies to me. Because it's all in L.A., and like the idea of driving over 60 anywhere in L.A., especially on the highways, is
and
laughable.
Not getting caught in traffic immediately. Yeah, no, it's pretty fucking funny.
Right, cool. Well, said my piece.
Yeah, no, I think that's good.
How spicy was that take? I would say, you know, it's a light sriracha. I think we came to agreement pretty quickly. But
yeah,
almost
I
immediately.
think on its face, it's a pretty contentious one.
I think for the general populace, for like most people, like having that discussion, like academic or not, like it's probably like relatively spicy. Because you get like staunch fans of either.
I think that it definitely does have a large kernel of truth, though. So it's I think that once you start unpacking it, like you definitely do see that more so. It definitely had some things to get into, so it was a little bit spicy. But also, like, it didn't make me have an aneurysm when it came out of your mouth. So
well, that's why I do like sriracha for that. It's like, like if you're into sriracha, like it's not gonna be that spicy. You know, we're into that kind of conversation.
Yeah,
but if you're not used to sriracha, you're not used to having that conversation. You feel spicy.
I do think how spicy something is has a lot to do with your tone when you say it. And if Cleveland is right, and you brought this up before saying that like thriller didn't have the same balls as horror, I think that is a way more contentious take.
I definitely said the exact same thing because I have it written down in my phone.
Well, you said that and then also that, like, but anyway,
that's a moot point. We've gotten our thoughts out.
Yeah.
And now it's time for a word from our sponsor.
Yeah, our sponsor. Who is it this week? Sorry, we've got such a long list.
Let's go to the sponsor shelf.
Yeah, so over on the sponsor shelf.
Sponsor shelf.
You know, all praise be to the sponsor shelf.
Sponsor shelf.
As was required to be said by the sponsor shelf. Yeah, it looks like this week we have good old Mr. Ribbert's cold blankets. Tired of using your blankets just for heat? Well, we got blankets just for cold. Come on down to Mr. Ribbert's cold blankets. That's right, you heard it here, folks. It's going to be taking the world by storm in all the areas where it's too hot to not wear a blanket. You can now wear a blanket even in the hot. Mr. Ribbert's cold blankets.
On a sweltering August day here in North Carolina, there's nothing more refreshing than to sit on the porch wrapped in a Mr. Ribbit's cold blanket. I have a mint julep in one hand, a fan in the other, and I am bundled in about 6 or 7 of Mr. Ribbit's cold blankets.
Now, if you're wondering about the science of Mr. Ribbert's cold blankets, well, let's get the microscope out and take a deeper dive. You see, Mr. Ribbert's cold blankets use special microfan technology, wherein the blanket, once plugged into the wall, or a generator if you're off the grid, you will find that the very microscopic little fans in the blanket power up and give you quite a nice summer breeze. Mr. Ribbert's cold blankets.
Thank you, Mr. Ribbert.
Guys, we killed that.
That'll bring us.
We're getting that sponsored back for sure.
That'll bring us to the end of this week's episode. Next week, it's finally time for us.
Toot toot.
And I don't mean time for us as in us. I mean it's time for us.
As in us.
As in us. It's finally here. Us. And we're gonna go see Us.
Wait! Oh, I can't wait.
And I'm so excited. Yeah. Like I tried to go into it not watching previews, but they were just in the movie theater. Yeah. And then like Hulu has been throwing them at me hardcore the last couple of days. We're recording this quite a bit earlier than when it's coming out. I think by the time this episode is released, then Us will already be out. But I'm still super fucking excited to see it.
Yes.
And I'm hoping for another fucking slam dunk from Jordan Peele. So
I'm bright-eyed and bushy-tailed about it.
Get fucking hype to prepare yourself. Go back and listen to our episode on Get Out from, I believe, May of 2018. I don't know exactly, but you can find it. Go listen to our discussion there. It was me and Eugene and our friend Hannah, and it's a good episode. And yeah, next week, stay tuned for Us. Hi friends, just here with a quick update. When we recorded this episode on March the 2nd, we did not realize at the time that Us's release date got pushed back to March 22nd from March 15th. So unfortunately we're gonna have to wait another week for that. Next week, instead of Us, we will be doing The Witch, the 2015 film by Robert Eggers, one of my favorite films of the past decade, and my next pick for our individual picks. So get excited for that. We'll be talking about The Witch next week, and we will have our review of Us the week after. So apologies for that. We were disappointed to learn that as well. That one's not on us, that's on us. Back to the episode. And if you like Us, and by us I mean us boys, you can leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Hit those 5 stars or wherever else, like smash that fucking real big boy hours, and do that if you want more episodes. Also follow us on Twitter at PodPeoplePod. Follow us on Letterboxd at PodPeoplePod. Check out our back catalog, all of our fucking movies we've watched for the show and our ratings and all that shit. Follow me on Twitter at Mr. Van Awesome.
You can follow me on Twitter, tweeting for Light Arc Studios. And then you can also find my work on ArtStation under Cleveland Mosier or Iron Prism. And keep your ears to the rails for good old It Stares Back. Our demo is coming. All right, what's up, Ben?
So, I recently found out that Google has a new podcasting service. Oh. So if you're using Google Podcast,
is it different from Google Play Podcasts?
Yeah, it's different. It's like a standalone thing. It's super interesting. I haven't even downloaded it, but if you're listening to us from there, shoot us a spooky ghost emoji
Yeah.
With
But not too spooky. I don't want to get scared, man.
Shoot it at us on Twitter at PodPeoplePod or at my personal Twitter at Mr. Sheets.
But ghost emoji responsibly, all right?
Yeah, I scare easily.
Yeah, it's pretty spooky.
The first 3 ghosts I get, I'll send an e-cookie to. I'll just send a cookie emoji to.
Oh, okay.
Nice.
I thought it was like some kind of new Bitcoin. I wasn't familiar with. You said e-cookie. I was like, what the fuck is an e-cookie? I feel old.
That would be cryptocurrency, wouldn't it?
It probably already is.
But nothing soothes the soul more than a nice warm cookie.
Spooky ghost cookie.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you as always for listening. That'll do it for us this week. We are the Pod People. Until next time, go out and punch your fucking resident Nazi in the face.
Yeah, get him for America.
And the crown.
All right. I want to give a special shout out to the writer of Ministry of Fear. Same guy who wrote The Third Man. Killing it, dude. Third Man is awesome. I would definitely check it out. Some of the other great film noir movies you got to check out. Night of the Hunter, obviously. Got to watch Gun Crazy. Got to watch The Killers, meaning the 46 one, based on the Ernest Hemingway novel. The 64 one with Reagan, forget about it. Watch Ace in the Hole. You got to watch Shock Corridor. You got to watch 1, 2, 3. Oh, obviously, Touch of Evil. Check out Asphalt Jungle. I'm just listing off film noir movies at this point.
Film noir movies, that's good.
Oh, Out of the Past. Robert Mitchum is fucking awesome. That movie's great. Maltese Falcon is pretty solid. Not my favorite, but it's all right.
Maltese Falcon is fucking masterpiece.
Watch Ace in the Hole. I think I mentioned it, but watch it again a second time because that movie's amazing. Billy Wilder is a fucking master. Oh, watch Underground USA. Sam Fuller is underrated, and that's one of his most underrated movies. It's a noir movie that really goes to crazy places, especially for its time period. And that was my recommendation corner.